Hi, this is Kate Warren, Executive Vice President at Devex, continuing my series, Careers During COVID-19, helping our community better understand how this crisis is impacting workplaces and careers in global development. Today, I'm delighted to chat with John Farden, who's the Chief of Human Capital and Operations at R4D, Results for Development, joining us from his home in Washington, D.C., where I want to talk about how this pandemic has shifted the way they work and deliver programs, trends he's seeing in evolving career paths, both before and also as a result of this crisis, and generally how he sees the development, workplace, workforce, and human capital needs and demands changing in the future. So John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, and I just recently here was joined by my dogs too. So this is one of the ways in which human capital has changed in the recent weeks as we get lots of visitors during our meetings and interviews. So
that's great. Well, I've bribed my kids to stay with our dog in the kitchen, so hopefully hopefully that sticks.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. Well, just to kick off, I'd love to hear from your perspective overseeing the human capital and operations. How has these recent, I think maybe it's been 6-7 weeks for us, at least here in the DC area, has it shifted really the way you work and operate?
Well, I mean, has shifted and continues to shift sort of on a ongoing basis. So we're evolving and learning as we go. Certainly, the first things that we were considering was how to make sure our staff were safe and in a place where they were comfortable hunkering down for the foreseeable future. So that included, bringing some folks back to the U.S. and just making sure that people were safe and comfortable where they were. And then thinking about how, we're all making this shift to doing much more of these video meetings and trying to stay connected virtually. And just trying to get to some sense of normalcy and business continuity, even as we were moving remote. We, of course, are incredibly fortunate to work in a workforce that generally allows us to do this fairly effectively. I mean, of course, there are pieces that we can't do, but it's been, we have to remember to stay thankful for the fact that we are able to still be, reasonably effective, even working remotely. And then as we started to think about sort of the longer term impacts, we started thinking about, of course, the commitments we've already made and how those scopes of work would be impacted and try to sort of take a triage approach to looking at things that could continue as planned, things that needed to continue, but with some modification to the plan, and then things that we needed to either cancel or delay. I think having open and early communication with both our implementing partners on the ground as well as our funding partners has helped a lot, and I hope we've gotten and will continue to get good marks from our partners and communicating well and sort of letting them know what's going on. Now, as we think about the longer term impacts, I mean, I think we're hunkering down to think that this is a way of working that will go on for months, if not years. So thinking about all the things that we try to get done, and which of those things can be done really effectively remotely, and then which ones do we really need to think harder about new approaches to supporting this work virtually. So things like starting a new project, or things like building trust and commitment from new partners, or just all of that. When you think about traveling internationally, going to large conferences, all of the conversations that happen in the SUV on the way out to do a community visit, or at the coffee station during a 15-minute break, that stuff is very, very difficult to recreate when we're not together in person. So, there's a huge, I mean, it's hard to, it would be hard to articulate a part of our business that isn't impacted by this. So we're just trying to be as adaptive and thoughtful and iterative as we can be as we sort of learn more and the crisis unfolds.
Interesting, and your prediction of this being not just months, but maybe even years of our new normal, as I think many of us have been describing it. So can you give some examples on how you are approaching things like a project startup or monitoring evaluation, onboarding, stakeholder engagement virtually? Are these some lessons you've learned that you think have been helpful and could be helpful for others that are trying to do the same?
Yeah. So, I mean, for us, we work in a lot of different ways with partners on the ground. First, I will say that our way of working, we leverage local change agents. We work with partners on the ground as our way of interacting. So this shift in the way of working is not only a shift in the way R4D works, but we also have to be really mindful of what our partners on the ground are experiencing, right? So this includes, thinking about the advice of public health experts, and also thinking about local governmental restrictions to activities that are happening in the places where we work. And it's as I'm sure incredibly varied across the world, right? The way that different governments have addressed this crisis have been very varied. So we want to both look at the public health implications, but also look at the local government restrictions that are being imposed. And that's, not only for our people, but for staff or for our partners as well. Project Startup has been an interesting one to consider. I think as we think about relationship building, sort of shifting to more of a virtual approach with longstanding partners or with ongoing work is challenging. But trying to do that with a brand new project where you're working with new partners and trying to build that trust and develop ways of working together is especially challenging. So we have a couple of examples, a new project in Ethiopia that's just getting started, where trying to staff up, trying to think about how we're going to do co-design, co-creation kind of activities virtually is much more difficult when you haven't even started the work yet. So I would say in terms of lessons learned, we're still learning. But definitely one of the things I would say is to think about the sort of component parts of an engagement. So, I mean, there's the sort of, background information where you're sending reading materials in advance so folks can review them and get up to speed. That doesn't really change all that much. And I think that's something that can continue, pretty much as before. But when you think about those concentrated, everybody's in a room together in a co-creation workshop, or everybody's in a room together for a learning event, or that's very hard to recreate. So what we think is that, that those activities are going to have to be spread out over a longer period of time with sustained duration of engagement with partners, as opposed to happening sort of in that day and a half workshop, where everyone's together in the same room. So we're of course still thinking through those pieces, but that's sort of how we're starting to think about it, is really listening to our partners, understanding what their context is on the ground, and then thinking about those component parts of our engagements and trying to break them up so that we're, doing the things that we can do effectively remotely. We're doing those well, but also thinking through the pieces that are harder to achieve remotely and trying to be innovative about new ways of approaching those.
Yeah, and R4D largely relies on local talent and organizations that you partner with to implement your project. So how has this better prepared you for this moment? And what lessons do you think other organizations can learn from pursuing this model?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, I think I would say with all humility that no one could be totally prepared for something like this. So certainly we're not, we're learning a lot as well. But it definitely, I think, our approach is to really take a systems approach and to think about the challenging problems that health systems or education systems are facing from the perspective of what are the challenges that local change agents want to solve, listening to the challenges they want to solve. And so building that sort of ethos into our work and listening to, okay, in one place, it might be really focused on supply chain around medication for pneumonia. In another place, it might be thinking about moving towards universal health care, listening to what the priorities are of local change agents. And those priorities are changing really rapidly right now because of the global pandemic. And so having a culture that is used to that, that's used to sort of adapting and taking an adaptive learning approach to solving problems I think is incredibly useful as the context changes so quickly.
Yeah, that's a great, really important point. And there's been this longstanding this shift to local ownership of programming, and that meaning hiring more locally and engaging more with local organizations. But there's always been this kind of long-standing division between the international and local staff. International typically being Western donor country nationals. So how do you see career paths evolving and the different options for development professionals, whether you are one of those places like, American sitting in Washington, D.C. that's used to traveling around a lot, whether for short-term or long-term projects, or you are a development professional in a program country. How are you seeing these lines being blurred and changed, both before this crisis, but then perhaps being even expedited because of it?
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it is something that I think will be accelerated by this global pandemic, but those shifts were already underway, as you say. And I think that there was a career path in global development in the past that looked like becoming the leading expert on health systems in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And that career path, more and more, we want the leading experts on sub-Saharan health in sub-Saharan Africa to be from sub-Saharan Africa, right? So that means that it's a different kind of skill set and role that we're looking for. And is expertise still important for an international INGO? Absolutely. But there's another set of skills around facilitation, around knowledge translation, around coaching, that we feel like at R4D are going to be that secret sauce in the future. That's about, I mean, there's plenty of good research that sits on a shelf, or there's plenty of good examples of innovations that have worked in one context and in a neighboring country or halfway around the world. Nobody knows about those innovations, and so all of that work of translation still needs to happen. I've done a lot of work in the United States, and you think about all of the resources and all of the great knowledge and expertise that we have here in the United States, and our country still fails to meet the health and education needs of its neediest citizens, right? So it's not just about the resources. A lot of it is about figuring out how to get those resources to the right place. So we really at R4D think that our role more and more in the future is going to be about helping unlock that knowledge, translate that knowledge, put it in the hands of local change agents and help facilitate that work. That in some ways is a radical shift from what we've done in the past, but it also is a really exciting career path for young professionals to think about working with leading experts who are not just from Harvard or London School of Economics or George Washington University, but have come up working on health system challenges in the countries where this work is happening. And that, I think, is a really exciting shift, and one that I hope will keep our industry really vibrant for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and what role do you see donors playing in this? I know a lot of funders have really encouraged and incentivized or even required filling key positions with local personnel. But often that comes along with very high qualification requirements that might be hard to tick all those boxes. So curious what kind of conversations you're having with funders or seeing in flexibility to how you identify and qualify this top talent when maybe this older notion of somebody who has their Harvard PhD and X years of experience in this very specific area being the ideal candidate. Are you seeing any changes there?
Yeah, yes, and I mean, I think there are changes in a lot of different ways. Like, I mean, I think if you look at some sort of the developing nations who are furthest ahead, like Indonesia or Bangladesh or others who have really robust higher education systems, I think that's where we might look for sort of how things will look in the future, where it's really easy to find an expert on you know, whatever it is, from you know, financial accountants to health system experts to whatever in a lot of countries in South Asia now. And you're seeing that more and more across the world, right? And so the idea that expertise only comes out of Harvard now is antiquated, right, already. But at the same time, I think for especially some of the larger INGOs who do have huge capacities in the North and in the West, making that transition to moving more capacity to the places where we work is challenging, and it's not always supported by donors. I mean, it's sort of rhetorically supported by donors, but if they keep those requirements for accountability and knowledge of, you know, U.S. government reporting requirements, et cetera, you know, what ends up happening is you end up with many layers of bureaucracy. You end up with, you know, award management located at the country level, the local level, the regional level, the headquarters in DC level, and that is not an efficient way to operate. So we need to sort of hold hands and go together to say that if we're going to shift more responsibility and accountability to our local partners or to our national staff, there has to be some change in the way we think about the global standards that we hold for accountability to donors. And it's particularly challenging for organizations with very diverse funding streams who, you know, if you look at that from a country level, if you're, you know, a finance officer in a country that gets funding from, you know, DFID, USAID, Gates Foundation, you know, it's incredibly difficult to think that you're going to be an expert in reporting requirements for all of those different donors. So some sort of global standards, I think, would also be really useful in facilitating that transition. And I do think that transition will be accelerated by what we're going through right now.
Yeah, and you mentioned preparing for really working remotely for the foreseeable future, which does open up the possibility to really have candidates fill roles anywhere in the world. And if you look at a lot of the international NGOs, a lot of the operations and some of those typical home office duties are done in the HQ that might be in DC or another, you know, northwestern city, but people can work anywhere and everywhere. Do you see that enabling opportunities for people in other parts of the world, maybe even in your program countries, to play some of these kind of critical operational roles?
For sure, yeah, and I think some of that is a paradigm shift for us as well in thinking about global staff, global human capital as being global assets to the organization. I think a lot of times the way we think about our country staff is they're hired to implement a project, a scope of work, and don't always think about what is the value add to other projects even within the same country, let alone like across the region, let alone across the world. So I think moving that mentality towards how do we leverage our global workforce to provide benefit to our organization as a whole. And if we can think about the top talent not only being in London and in DC, but being in Accra and Addis Ababa and Jakarta and, you know, all the other places where we work, suddenly you've got a much more diverse and talented pool of experts to draw from. And, you know, besides some of the limitations around travel, there's limitations around visas, right? Where we already were having challenges in getting talented folks from overseas to our headquarters on long-term work visas anyway, right? So being able to think about leveraging people in the places where they live to add value not only in that location, but to our global organization, I think is incredibly exciting, and hopefully a pivot that this helps to accelerate.
That's great. And so what advice would you have for somebody who is just starting out their career in development? You know, there's a lot of students that are about to graduate, even from graduate programs, are looking to launch a career in this sector. Given these changes and shifts, what advice would you have to them as to ways they can build and develop and think about their career that is adding value, but recognizing that there are these big shifts that are happening?
So I think getting some expertise in a specific thematic area is still going to be important. I think that gets you a seat at the table. You know, as knowing something about the work that you're supporting. But really more and more, we're going to think about this transferable skill set that's about project management, that's about leading diverse groups. And that is a skill set that, you know, there's lots of different ways to think about it, whether it's, you know, getting an MBA or taking some project management courses, or, you know, working with colleagues in your organization who have that kind of skill set. But being able to step in, particularly early in your career, and say, I want to lead this project, I can do this, and managing it through, those are the kinds of transferable skills that are going to be needed forever, right? That are about not just being the smartest person in the room, but helping a room full of smart people get to a really great result. And you know, that to me is a role that is evergreen. You know, that's not going to go out of style. And it is going to be something that you know, systems around the world, particularly in lower resource settings, are going to continue to need that expertise, even as some of the more thematic expertise starts to be locally grown, locally cultivated. So that would be one piece of advice. And the other would be to you know, think about building a diverse skill set as you move around in an organization. I think, you know, for a long time, we've had this sense that you have your sort of management track, and we have your technical track, and you either become really expert in sort of general management, or you become really expert in thematic, a content area, and that more and more of those are going to become, both of those things are going to be required. So finding ways to sort of build both of those skill sets through early on in your career will make you a really valuable player, whatever path you take along the road.
Yeah, I love that. We've done several surveys in recent years around the future development professional, and one of the findings that always comes through is that ability to be agile and flexible, and this career path that we've been describing as the integrator, where it's, you're not just the expert or the management generalist, but somebody who can see and work within and across silos and across stakeholders, and those really being the people that are going to be in demand and successful heading forward.
I totally agree.
So we actually did just do another survey. We're about to release the results around how this is impacting careers and workplaces, and around 94% of the professionals we surveyed said that they think this crisis will have significant, long-lasting effects on the global development community. In your opinion, what do you see as the biggest long-term consequences, and also what experiences have you had that you think will really forever change the way you work and operate for the better?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly on the negative side, I think that global travel, and not only global travel, but also like large scale convening, so big international conferences, those kinds of things, are going to be considered very differently in the future than they have been in the past. And so, I mean, there's so much of being an international development professional that sort of revolves around those things, those big events during the year where everybody's together in Bangkok, or you know, you're going out and doing TA visits. And I do think we're going to think about that travel very differently for the foreseeable future, maybe forever. So that's one shift. And I mean, I think there's some positive aspects to that, but I think overall, most people would agree that that's a negative consequence. From the positive side, certainly there are some ways, some crutches that we relied on for meeting in person that we're all having to experience now more virtually. And I hope will be with us to stay, right? You know, that we find ways that we can be more efficient and work better. And this will really sort of, you know, make really clear to us what are the things that we absolutely have to be together to do effectively, and where were we getting together and spending a lot of money on international travel and, you know, putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, et cetera, that maybe we can pull back on. So I think that's really positive. And then I hope the most positive thing that comes out of this is, you know, you look at some of the countries in Asia who dealt with SARS, you look at you know, some of the health systems improvements that have been made in West Africa post 2014 Ebola outbreak. You know, and having been in the international development industry for 15 plus years, you know, we've been talking about a global pandemic for a long time, and it was like, you know, every organization I feel like has a handful of folks who are like, really, oh, this is going to happen. It's coming. We know it's coming. And I feel like some of us sort of felt like, oh, maybe, or maybe not. The fact that we're having to deal with it at a global level, I hope will lead to a focus on health systems that is not just about sort of, you know, developing a vaccine and fighting COVID, but is about making sure that we're nimble and prepared and smarter and, you know, more science-based all around the world in how we think about public health. You know, and it's a public health issue. It's an economic issue. It's a societal issue. You know, obviously, for those of us with young children, we feel it very acutely that it's an education issue. And all across the world, we have, you know, millions and millions and millions of children who are out of school. So where we are now is not where we want to be in the future, and potentially, you know, we've been lucky with other epidemics that haven't turned into global pandemics, but potentially we'll be better prepared in the future for the next crisis that comes.
Yeah, let's hope it's a good wake-up call for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, what are you most looking forward to doing when things get back to relative normality?
I'm an extrovert at heart, so not being with people has been challenging for me, and I'm looking forward to going and seeing some live music. That's another thing I've really missed. And then you know, I will say on a personal note, I'm also looking forward to going and visiting my parents and my in-laws, and my kids are definitely missing their grandparents. So that's high on the list as well.
Great. Well, I grew up in Austin, live music capital of the world. So that's one of the things I'm missing too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
hopefully we'll be able to get back out there soon. Well, thank you so much, John, for talking with us today and sharing your insights.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, best of luck to you and your team. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll chat again soon.
Thank you.